I remember the first day I met Jerry in middle school. We were assigned to the same science project, and I was nervous as hell. He flashed me a grin and said, "Hey, I'm Jerry. Let's ace this thing." Jerry was the kind of guy everyone liked. He had this effortless charm, always making people laugh. We clicked instantly, spending hours working on our project, and soon enough, hanging out after school. We'd play video games, talk about our favorite movies, and occasionally we'd sneak into the kitchen to raid the fridge. Jerry was always there, whether I needed help with homework or just someone to talk to. One afternoon, while we were playing basketball, Jerry turned to me and said, "You're pretty good at this. We should join the school's team." Me? On the team, I laughed, shaking my head. "Nah, I'm not that good." "Come on, Keith. You just need a bit of practice." "I'll help you out," he insisted, tossing the ball to me. We spent countless afternoons practicing, and true to his word, Jerry helped me get better. By the end of the season, I was starting to think that maybe I could be good at something. It wasn't just basketball. Jerry had a way of making me feel like I belonged. Our friendship grew stronger with each passing day. He was the first person I called when I got good news and the first to know when I was down. We became inseparable, and I couldn't imagine my life without him. High school came, and with it, a whirlwind of changes. Jerry and I were still best friends, but something inside me began to shift. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but suddenly I found myself watching him a bit too closely, my heart racing whenever he smiled at me. One night, after a late study session at his place, Jerry fell asleep on the couch. I watched him for a moment, his chest rising and falling gently, and an unfamiliar feeling washed over me. I quickly looked away, feeling guilty and confused. The next day, as we walked to class, Jerry was talking about some girl he liked. "She's so cool, Keith. I think I might ask her out." I forced a smile, my stomach twisting. "Yeah, she seems nice," I muttered, trying to sound supportive. But inside, a storm was brewing. I couldn't shake off the jealousy and the strange, aching feeling in my chest. I started avoiding his eyes, afraid he might see what I was starting to realize about myself. One afternoon, while we were sitting in the library, Jerry nudged me. "You okay? You've been kinda quiet lately?" "Yeah, just tired," I guess I lied, my heart pounding in my chest. He studied me for a moment, then shrugged. "All right, just let me know if you need to talk." That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I was in love with Jerry. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. I knew I couldn't tell him he was my best friend, and I didn't want to ruin everything we had. Days turned into weeks, and my feelings only grew stronger. Every touch, every laugh, every moment we spent together was a mix of joy and agony. I tried to push my feelings aside, to act normal, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. One weekend we went camping with a few friends. As we sat around the campfire, Jerry sat next to me, our shoulders touching. The warmth of the fire and his closeness made my heart race. I turned to look at him, catching his eyes for a brief moment before quickly looking away. "Keith, you seem off. Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine, Jerry. Just a lot on my mind." He nodded, accepting my answer, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I wanted to tell him the truth, to explain the turmoil inside me, but the fear of losing him kept me silent. The rest of the trip was a blur of laughter and camaraderie, but inside I was struggling. I knew I had to deal with my feelings, but I had no idea how. All I knew was that Jerry was my best friend, and I was hopelessly, painfully in love with him. Returning from the camping trip, my mind was in turmoil. Every time I saw Jerry, my heart ached with a confusing mix of longing and fear. Schoolwork and hanging out with Jerry provided some distraction, but my feelings for him were growing too strong to ignore. One evening we were in my room playing video games. I was losing badly, unable to concentrate. Jerry noticed and paused the game. "Keith, seriously, what's up? You've been acting weird for weeks." I hesitated, then said, "It's just, I've got a lot on my mind. School stuff, you know." Jerry frowned. "You sure it's just school? You can talk to me about anything, man." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, thanks, Jerry." That night after Jerry left, I found myself staring at the mirror, questioning everything. How could I be in love with my best friend? What did that say about me? Growing up in a conservative town, I'd never really confronted my sexuality. Now it was staring me in the face, and I was terrified. The next day at school, I couldn't focus. During lunch, I excused myself and went to the bathroom, splashing water on my face, trying to calm down. A classmate, Dan, walked in and raised an eyebrow. "You okay, Keith?" "Yeah, just having a rough day," I muttered. "Well, if you ever need to talk, you know where to find me," he said, offering a small smile before leaving. Back in class, my thoughts kept drifting. I realized I needed to understand myself better. That evening, I spent hours online, reading about other people's experiences, trying to find some clarity. It was a relief to see that I wasn't alone, but it also made me more aware of the challenges ahead. One night, I overheard my mom talking to a friend on the phone. "I'm worried about Keith. He's been so distant lately." I sighed, leaning against the wall, feeling guilty for making her worry. I decided to try and talk to her, but finding the right words was harder than I imagined. The next morning, over breakfast, I took a deep breath. "Mom, can I talk to you about something?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" she replied, looking concerned. I've been feeling really confused lately. About who I am and what I want," I said, avoiding her eyes. She reached out, squeezing my hand. "It's okay to be confused, Keith. Take your time to figure things out. Just know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Her words were a comfort, but I still felt a heavy weight on my chest. The next few weeks were a blur of self-reflection and quiet contemplation. Jerry noticed my distance, but he didn't push. We still hung out, but there was a tension between us that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, while we were studying, Jerry suddenly asked, "Keith, are we okay? It feels like there's this wall between us lately." I looked at him, my heart pounding. "Yeah, we're okay. I've just got a lot going on in my head. I'm trying to sort through it." He nodded, looking relieved. "Well, if you need anything, I'm here. You know that, right?" "Yeah, I know," I said, managing a small smile. "Thanks, Jerry." Inside, I was still struggling, but knowing that Jerry cared made it a little easier. I knew I had to come to terms with my identity, but I wasn't sure how. All I knew was that I needed to take it one day at a time, and maybe, just maybe, things would eventually make sense. Days turned into weeks, and the internal struggle continued to consume me. The more time I spent with Jerry, the more certain I became of my feelings. I knew I couldn't keep this secret forever. It was eating me up inside. One evening, after another awkward study session where I barely spoke, Jerry finally confronted me. "Keith, seriously, we need to talk." "What's going on?" "You're my best friend, and I can't stand seeing you like this." I looked at him, my heart racing. I knew this was it. I couldn't keep lying to him or to myself. "Jerry, there's something I need to tell you," I said, my voice shaking. He sat down next to me, his expression serious. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." I took a deep breath, feeling like I was about to jump off a cliff. "Jerry, I've been feeling different lately. About us. About you." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I think I'm in love with you," I blurted out, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. For a moment there was complete silence. Jerry just stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. I felt like my heart was about to burst out of my chest. You're what?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm in love with you, Jerry," I repeated more quietly this time. "I know you're straight, and I don't expect anything from you. I needed to tell you. I couldn't keep it inside anymore." Jerry stood up, running his hands through his hair. "Keith, I don't know what to say." I stood too, trying to hold back tears. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know, you're my best friend, and I couldn't keep lying to you." He looked at me, his expression torn. "I need some time to think about this." "I understand," I said, feeling a wave of relief and fear wash over me. "Take all the time you need." For the next few days, things were tense. Jerry avoided me at school, and I spent most of my time alone, wondering if I had made a huge mistake. My mind was a whirlwind of regret and anxiety, but I knew I had done the right thing by being honest. One afternoon, while I was sitting alone in the cafeteria, Jerry walked up to me. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, my heart pounding. We went outside, finding a quiet spot behind the school. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Jerry began, looking uncomfortable. I don't feel the same way, Keith. I'm not gay. I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. I know, Jerry, I didn't expect you to. But you're still my best friend, he continued. I don't want this to change that. Really, I asked, a glimmer of hope in my voice. Yeah, really, he said, managing a small smile. It'll be weird for a while, but we'll get through it. For the first time in days, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Thanks, Jerry. That means a lot to me. Just promise me one thing, he said, looking serious again. Don't ever keep something like this from me again. If you're going through something, I want to know. I promise, I said, feeling a sense of relief and gratitude. No more secrets. As we walked back to the cafeteria, I knew things wouldn't be the same, but at least we had a chance to move forward. Telling Jerry the truth was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the bravest. And somehow I knew we'd be okay. The next few days were a blur of awkwardness and tentative steps towards normalcy. Jerry and I tried to hang out like we used to, but there was an unspoken tension between us that neither of us knew how to address. It felt like walking on eggshells, each of us careful not to bring up the confession that had changed everything. One Friday afternoon, we decided to shoot some hoops after school, a ritual that had always been our way of unwinding. As we played, I could feel Jerry's eyes on me, his silence more telling than words. Finally, during a break, he threw the ball to the side and sat down on the grass. Keith, we need to really talk about this, he said, patting the spot next to him. I sat down, the autumn leaves crunching beneath me. I know, I replied, bracing myself for whatever was coming. Jerry took a deep breath. I've been trying to wrap my head around this. You're my best friend, and I care about you. But I just can't see you that way. I understand, I said quickly, not wanting him to feel pressured. I never expected you to feel the same. I just couldn't keep it to myself anymore. He nodded, looking relieved. I get that, and I appreciate your honesty. But we need to set some boundaries, you know. Yeah, I get it, I said, my chest tightening. Just tell me what you need. I need some space to figure this out, he said, his eyes earnest. I don't want to lose our friendship, but I need time to adjust to all of this. I swallowed hard, nodding. Take all the time you need, Jerry. I'll be here. The next few weeks were some of the loneliest of my life. Jerry kept his distance, and I spent more time by myself, trying to keep busy with school and other activities. I missed him terribly, but I knew he needed this space. I used the time to focus on myself, diving into my studies and even joining a few clubs to fill the void. One afternoon, as I was leaving the library, I ran into Dan, the classmate who had offered a listening ear weeks ago. Hey, Keith. How have you been? He asked, his smile warm and genuine. Hey, Dan. I'm hanging in there, I replied, surprised at how much I meant it. Do you want to grab a coffee or something? He asked. I could use a break from studying, and it looks like you could too. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, that sounds good. We walked to a nearby cafe, chatting about school and random topics. It felt good to talk to someone, to not feel so isolated. As we sipped our drinks, Dan leaned in slightly. You know, you can talk to me about anything, right? No judgment. I smiled, feeling a flicker of warmth. Thanks, Dan. That means a lot. Over the next few weeks, Dan and I grew closer. He never pushed me to talk about Jerry or my feelings, but his presence was a comfort. One evening while we were walking home from school, I finally opened up to him. I told Jerry I was in love with him, I said quietly. He's straight, and it didn't go well. Dan nodded, his expression understanding. That must have been really hard. It was, I admitted. But I had to do it. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. You're brave, Keith, Dan said, his eyes sincere. It's not easy to be honest about your feelings, especially when you know it might not go the way you want. Hearing that felt like a balm to my wounded heart. Thanks, Dan, I appreciate that. As we parted ways, I felt a bit lighter, like the weight of my secret was finally lifting. I knew I had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while I felt hopeful. Jerry and I might not be the same, but maybe that was okay. And with friends like Dan, I knew I wasn't alone. The more time passed, the more I realized that things between Jerry and me would never go back to how they were. One Friday evening, as I was heading home, my phone buzzed with a text from Jerry. "We need to talk." "Meet me at the park?" My heart pounded as I walked to our usual spot at the park. Jerry was already there, pacing. He looked up as I approached, his face a mask of frustration. "Keith, this isn't working," he said bluntly. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew. "I've tried, okay? I've really tried to be okay with this, but I can't. It's too weird. You're in love with me and I can't handle that." I felt a sharp stab of pain in my chest. "Jerry, I told you I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to be honest." He shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. "But it changes everything, Keith. I can't just ignore it. Everywhere I go, people are talking. They're saying things about us. So this is about what people think I shot back," my own anger rising. "It's about how I feel," he yelled. "I feel uncomfortable, okay? I can't be around you knowing you have those feelings." I took a step back, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. "So what, you want to end our friendship? Just like that?" Jerry ran a hand through his hair, looking torn. "I don't know what I want. I just know I can't do this anymore." Before I could say anything else, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there stunned and hurt. I watched him go, feeling a mix of heartbreak and anger. How could he just walk away like that? How could he let other people's opinions ruin what we had? Over the next few days, things got worse. At school, the whispers and stares followed me everywhere. Someone had found out about my confession, and now everyone seemed to know. The bullying that had been mostly subtle became more overt. People shoved me in the halls, called me names, and laughed as I walked by. One afternoon, as I was heading to my locker, a group of guys cornered me. "Hey look, it's the fag," one of them sneered. I tried to push past them, but they blocked my way. "Where do you think you're going?" another one taunted. "Leave me alone," I muttered, trying to keep my cool. Or what one of them said, shoving me hard. I stumbled back, hitting the lockers. A sudden rush of anger surged through me. I clenched my fists, ready to fight back, but before I could, I heard a familiar voice. "Back off." I looked up to see Dan standing there, glaring at the bullies. "Get lost," he said firmly. The bullies exchanged looks but eventually backed off, muttering under their breaths. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling a mix of gratitude and shame. I hated that I needed rescuing, but I was glad Dan had been there. "Thanks," I said quietly as the bullies walked away. Dan gave me a small smile. "Anytime, you okay?" "Yeah, just tired of all this," I admitted. "I get it," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "But don't let them get to you. You're stronger than you think." I nodded, feeling a flicker of determination. As we walked to our next class, I couldn't help but think about Jerry. He was avoiding me, but I knew we needed to have one last conversation. I wasn't going to let our friendship end without a fight. That evening, I sent Jerry a text. "We need to talk. Meet me at the park tomorrow." The next day, I arrived at the park early, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I had to try. When Jerry finally showed up, he looked as conflicted as I felt. "Hey," he said, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Hey," I replied. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before I finally spoke. "Jerry, I know things are messed up right now, but you're my best friend. I don't want to lose that." He sighed, looking down. "I don't either, Keith. But I don't know how to make this work." "Maybe we just need time," I suggested. "Time to adjust, to figure things out." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe you're right. I just need some space." "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Take all the space you need. I'll be here when you're ready." As he walked away, I felt a mix of hope and sadness. Things were far from perfect, but at least we were trying. And that was enough for now. As days turned into weeks, Jerry and I barely spoke. The space he needed became a chasm between us, and the whispers around school grew louder. It felt like everyone knew about my confession, and they had made it their mission to remind me of it every single day. One morning as I walked into school, a group of students started snickering. "Hey Keith, how's your boyfriend?" one of them shouted, making the others burst into laughter. I kept my head down, pretending not to hear, but the words stung. In the cafeteria, I sat alone, picking at my food. My appetite had vanished along with my social life. Jerry sat at another table with his new friends, avoiding my gaze. I couldn't blame him, I knew it was hard for him too. But it still hurt. Dan tried to include me in his group of friends, but I felt like an outsider. They were nice enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a charity case. One day, during lunch, Dan sat down next to me. "Hey man, why don't you come sit with us?" I shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "I'm fine here." "Come on, Keith. You don't have to go through this alone," he insisted, his voice filled with concern. I sighed, knowing he was right but too proud to admit it. "Thanks, Dan. Maybe tomorrow." As I walked to my next class, I passed Jerry in the hallway. Our eyes met briefly, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the old Jerry, the one who was my best friend. But then he looked away, and the moment was gone. The bullying escalated. One afternoon, while I was at my locker, someone shoved me from behind, causing me to drop my books. "Watch it," fag, a voice sneered. I turned around to see Mark, one of the school's biggest jerks, smirking at me. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my cool. "Leave me alone, Mark." Or what he taunted, stepping closer. "You gonna cry?" Before I could respond, he shoved me again, harder this time. I stumbled, hitting the lockers. A crowd had gathered, eager for a show. Just as Mark raised his fist, a teacher rounded the corner, and the crowd dispersed. I gathered my books, feeling humiliated and angry. The teacher, Mrs. Thompson, approached me. "Are you okay, Keith?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I muttered, trying to hold back tears. "If you ever need to talk, my door is always open," she said gently. "Thanks," I replied, though I knew I wouldn't take her up on the offer. Talking wouldn't change anything. That evening, I found myself at the park, sitting on the swings where Jerry and I used to hang out. I missed him terribly, but I knew things would never be the same. The loneliness was suffocating, but I didn't know how to fix it. As I swung back and forth, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Dan approaching. "Hey," he said, sitting on the swing next to mine. "Hey," I replied, surprised to see him. "I figured I'd find you here," he said, giving me a small smile. "Want to talk about it?" I shrugged. Not much to say. Just tired of everything. Dan nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I get it. High school sucks sometimes, but it won't last forever." "Feels like it will," I muttered. He looked at me, his eyes serious. "You're stronger than you think, Keith. Don't let them break you." Hearing those words gave me a small glimmer of hope. "Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it." As we sat there in silence, I realized I wasn't completely alone. I had Dan, and maybe that was enough for now. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of determination. I wouldn't let the bullies win. I would find a way to keep going, no matter how hard it got. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next. The bullying continued, but I tried to keep my head down and focus on surviving each day. Dan was a constant presence, his friendship a lifeline in the storm. Still, the weight of isolation was heavy, and I felt like I was barely holding on. One afternoon, as I was heading to my locker, I found a note shoved into it. My heart sank, expecting another cruel message, but when I opened it, I saw it was from Jerry. "Meet me at the park after school. We need to talk." I folded the note, my emotions a mix of hope and dread. The last time we had a serious conversation, it hadn't gone well, but I knew I had to see him. Maybe this time would be different. When I arrived at the park, Jerry was already there, sitting on the swing, looking lost in thought. I walked over and sat down on the swing next to him. "Hey," I said quietly. "Hey," he replied, not looking at me. For a moment we sat in silence, the tension between us palpable. Finally, Jerry spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Keith, about everything." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Me too." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was a jerk. I freaked out, and I hurt you. I'm sorry." His apology took me by surprise. "It's okay, Jerry. I get it. This is new for both of us." He shook his head. "No, it's not okay. I let other people's opinions get in the way of our friendship. I was scared of what it meant, and I pushed you away." I felt a lump in my throat, but I forced myself to speak. "Jerry, I understand. It was a lot to take in. I miss my best friend." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with regret. "I miss you too. Can we try to fix this?" A small spark of hope flickered in my chest. "I'd like that." Jerry nodded, a tentative smile on his face. "It's not going to be easy. People are still going to talk, but I don't want to let that get between us anymore." "Me neither," I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. As we sat there, talking about everything and nothing, I felt a sense of relief. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Jerry and I had a long way to go, but at least we were taking the first step together. The next day at school, things felt different. The whispers and stares were still there, but I didn't feel as alone. Jerry walked with me to class, and while it was awkward at first, it felt right. Dan noticed the change and gave me a thumbs up, his support unwavering. During lunch, Jerry and I sat together, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of normalcy. We talked about our classes, our favorite shows, and everything in between. It was like old times, and it gave me hope that we could rebuild what we had lost. One afternoon, as we were leaving school, we ran into Mark and his cronies. They sneered, making their usual snide comments, but this time, Jerry stood his ground. "Back off, Mark. We're not afraid of you." Mark looked taken aback, but he quickly recovered. "Oh yeah? What are you going to do about it?" Before Jerry could respond, Dan stepped in, his expression fierce. "You heard him. Leave them alone." The confrontation drew a crowd, and for a moment, I feared it would escalate. But Mark, sensing the shift in power, backed off with a scowl. "Whatever. Let's go," he muttered to his friends. As they walked away, I felt a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, guys," I said, looking at Jerry and Dan. Jerry smiled, clapping me on the back. "We're in this together, Keith." Dan nodded. "Yeah, we've got your back." For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of belonging. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with friends like Jerry and Dan, I knew I could face whatever came my way. The bullying hadn't stopped, but I had found my strength again. And that was enough to keep going. The solidarity I felt with Jerry and Dan gave me a newfound sense of confidence. I started to stand a little taller, to walk with my head up. The bullies still taunted me, but their words had lost some of their sting. I knew I wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. One day, as I was heading to my locker, I saw a group of students huddled together, whispering and glancing my way. Among them was Mark, his smirk more pronounced than usual. Ignoring them, I went about my business, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up. During lunch, Jerry and I were sitting in the cafeteria when Mark and his cronies approached our table. "Hey Keith," Mark said loudly, drawing the attention of everyone around us. "Got a question for you." I glanced at Jerry, who nodded subtly. "What do you want, Mark?" Mark grinned. "I heard a little rumor. Is it true you're in love with Jerry?" The cafeteria went silent. All eyes were on us. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What's it to you?" Mark laughed, looking around at his friends for support. "Just curious. Everyone's been talking about it, wondering if it's true." Jerry stood up, his jaw set. "Back off, Mark. This is none of your business." Mark's grin faded. "I'm just asking a question." "Yeah, well, it's a stupid question," Jerry shot back. "Keith's my best friend, and who he loves is none of your concern." The cafeteria erupted in whispers. Mark looked taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure. "Whatever, man. Just trying to figure out how you can hang out with a fag." Jerry's face turned red with anger, and before I knew it, he lunged at Mark. "Don't you ever call him that again," he shouted, shoving Mark backward. Chaos ensued. Students stood up, shouting and forming a circle around us. A teacher rushed over, trying to break up the fight. I grabbed Jerry, pulling him back. "Jerry, stop. It's not worth it." Mark, regaining his balance, sneered, "See, even your boyfriend wants you to stop." I felt a surge of anger, and before I could stop myself, I stepped forward. "You think you're so tough, Mark? Picking on people just because they're different?" Well, guess what? I'm not scared of you anymore. The teacher, Mrs. Thompson, finally managed to get between us. That's enough, all of you, to the principal's office, now. As we walked to the office, the tension was palpable. Jerry was fuming, and I could feel my own anger simmering just beneath the surface. In the principal's office, we were all given detention and a stern lecture about fighting and harassment. After school, Jerry, Dan, and I sat on the steps outside, cooling off. Thanks for standing up for me, Jerry, I said quietly. But you didn't have to do that. Jerry sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yes, I did. I let you down before. I won't let it happen again. Dan nodded. We're in this together, remember? I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. Yeah, we are. The next day at school, things were different. The bullies still taunted us, but their words had less power. Other students started to stand up for us too, inspired by what had happened. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Jerry and I slowly rebuilt our friendship. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of awkwardness, but we were making progress. We talked more openly, shared more honestly, and learned to navigate our new reality together. One afternoon, as we were walking home, Jerry turned to me. Keith, I know things have been tough, but I'm glad we're still friends. Me too, I said, smiling. We've been through a lot, but I think we're stronger because of it. He nodded. Yeah, we are. And no matter what happens, I'll always have your back. As we reached my house, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew I wasn't alone. With friends like Jerry and Dan, I could face whatever challenges came my way. Our friendship had been tested, but it had come out stronger on the other side, and that was enough to give me hope for the future. Summer arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal. School ended, and with it, the daily taunts and whispers faded into the background. Jerry, Dan, and I spent our days hanging out, playing video games, and just being teenagers. The weight of the past months seemed to lift, and I started to feel like myself again. One evening, we decided to have a small bonfire at the park. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, we gathered around the crackling flames. Jerry passed me a marshmallow on a stick, and I couldn't help but smile at the simplicity of the moment. Hey Keith, Jerry said, his voice softening. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I'm really glad we got through it together. Me too, I replied, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. I know things were rough, but I wouldn't have wanted to go through it with anyone else. Dan, poking at the fire with a stick, grinned. You guys are so sappy. But seriously, I'm proud of us. We stuck together. As we talked and laughed, I realized how far we'd come. The fear and pain that had once consumed me had been replaced by a sense of belonging and acceptance. I knew now that I wasn't defined by others' opinions. I was stronger, more resilient, and surrounded by friends who had my back. The next day, as I was walking through town, I ran into Mrs. Thompson. She smiled warmly at me. Keith, how have you been? Good, Mrs. Thompson. Really good, I said, and for the first time in a long while I meant it. I'm glad to hear that, she replied. You know, you showed a lot of courage this year. I'm proud of you. Thank you, I said, feeling a swell of gratitude. It wasn't easy, but I had a lot of help. As summer progressed, I continued to rebuild my life. Jerry and I had our ups and downs, but our friendship was stronger than ever. We had learned to communicate better, to support each other, and to face challenges head-on. Dan remained a steady presence, his unwavering support a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. One afternoon, as we were lounging in Jerry's backyard, he turned to me. Keith, have you thought about what you want to do after high school? I shrugged. A little. I know I want to go to college, maybe study something that helps people. That's great, Jerry said, nodding. Whatever you do, I know you'll be amazing at it. Thanks, Jerry. What about you? I'm thinking about engineering, he said, a spark of excitement in his eyes. I've always loved building things, and I think it'd be a good fit. Sounds perfect for you, I said, genuinely happy for him. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel more confident about my future. The experiences of the past year had shaped me, but they didn't define me. I was ready to move forward, to embrace new opportunities and challenges. One evening, as we watched the stars from my backyard, I turned to Jerry and Dan. "You guys have been amazing. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jerry smiled. "We're a team, Keith. Always." Dan nodded. "Yeah, we've got each other's backs." I looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace and hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew I was ready for whatever came my way. With friends like Jerry and Dan by my side, I could face anything. As we sat there talking about our dreams and plans, I realized that this was just the beginning. The hardships we had faced had made us stronger, and now we were ready to take on the world together. New beginnings were on the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly hopeful about the future.